And again, you have to have the mentality to say, okay, this was before, what if we're starting all over? And thankfully, we've gone in other business in the past, like in real estate in the 1970s. We did things after World War II. So again, family history can be an aid in this kind of situation, this kind of turmoil, more intense than certainly we've ever had, but something that is not something that's never happened before. So succession, communications, all those kind of issues where emotions can just run amok. If you have outsiders, but have those constant meetings, formal and informal, just saves a lot of wear and tear, especially in an intense crisis where decisions have to be made. Toes are going to have to be stepped on, but people know that isn't something just because somebody did something dumb here or smart there. Everyone's been on the information loop right from the beginning. Now, in terms of looking ahead, in terms of what's going to dig us out of this thing, you can make a case that the situation is absolutely hopeless. You know, 1.4 trillion of deficits. World War II, which was a world war, we had big deficits, but never approaching these levels in peacetime. You look at the unfunded liabilities of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, 70, 80, 90 trillion dollars. Pick a number based on your assumptions. On paper, no way to do it. Higher taxes, there's talk about they may want to raise taxes. Go ahead, not going to help, especially marginal rates. Destroys capital, immobilizes capital like a weak dollar does. So what do? What you do, and eventually we'll stumble into it, just as we did 30 years ago, was the balance sheet. We all know about liabilities. So the only way liabilities become bearable is if you grow the asset side of the balance sheet. Just to make it simple, Bill Gates goes out and borrows $1 billion. No one's going to lose any sleep over it. Guy working at Dunkin' Donuts goes and borrows $1 billion. Couldn't, but a couple of years ago he probably could if he called it a mortgage. But borrowed $1 billion, huge problem. So this is how we dig out of it. If you have an environment of a sound dollar, lowering tax rates, which this administration at least now won't do, but I think eventually politics, if it doesn't force them, will force their successors to do it, just as we did in the early 80s, and a few other sensible things, you start not only getting growth, but you also get higher asset values. When people see that there is growth prospects, then obviously the current value of assets go up in anticipation of future income streams. Very basic. It worked. If you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, you could have made a grim forecast for the United States. Pensions way underwater, huge inflation, 18% mortgage rates and only good for 4 years, huge commodity speculation, currency speculation, oil going up and up and up. Disaster. And then if you did one number, if you then fast forward and said by the end of the 80s, the national debt was going to triple, or almost triple, you'd say, oh my God, the world's come to an end. Well, the national debt did go up $1.7 trillion in the 80s, from $1 trillion to 2.7. Reagan spent heavily on defense, which worked in that case. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But Congress, being Congress, would not do much in the way of domestic cuts. So the national debt went up $1.7 trillion. Now, given all the problems of the early 80s, you say, oh boy, this doesn't work. Well, it did work. Why? Because of his tax cuts and other reforms made, the United States entered a 20-year boom. Over 20 years. Our share of the global GDP went up. Our share of the global equity market value went up. And so at the end of the 80s, even though the national debt had gone up $1.7 trillion, the national wealth, and the Federal Reserve does these numbers every 3 months, household wealth, what people own and financial assets, hard assets, like your home, subtract out all the liabilities, credit card debt, bonded debt, mortgages, everything. The end of the 80s, up $17 trillion. That's how you dig yourself out. Having an environment where asset value can grow. And so, as you look ahead, in terms of your own particular situations and businesses, focus obviously on getting through this storm. There's no point in saying, I've got a great future if you can't get through this choppy seas now, roiling seas now. But also realize huge opportunities are going to open up as once again we build up the balance sheet. New players will emerge. Players can grow as never before because all of the old constraints are gone. People are looking at everything with a new set of eyes. Look at the 70s, dreadful decade, but look what was incubating. Microsoft, Apple, Sun Microsystems, Oracle, FedEx, Southwest Airlines, blossomed in the 80s. Silicon Valley blossomed in the 80s. Look at the new players. Just give you one example. Well, Charles Schwab was one example, another one. Fidelity, beginning of the 70s, a couple of mutual funds run by Mr. Johnson. Ned succeeds his father. People called him Neddy. They didn't mean it as a compliment. They said, how would Neddy going to do money management as well as Mr. Johnson did? Well, Neddy saw an opportunity. Neddy figured out he could hire people to manage the money. Their brains out there. Why try to do what others can do? Hire them. And he focused instead on technology on the back office so he could create not just one or two funds, but how about a couple of hundred funds and have the technology to handle millions of accounts, not a few tens of thousands of accounts. He's one of the first, other than Federated, that saw the real massive potential of money market funds, which were brand new in 1973, 1974. So Fidelity became a major player on our list. He's worth over $10 billion. His daughter Abigail, over $10 billion. But again, the whole environment had changed, and he knew how to realize the constraints of the past were lost. So bottom line, in terms of family dynamics, there is no real secret. It's just how you execute communications, dealing with all the minefields out there, but making sure no one can say, I didn't know. We made sure you do know on a constant basis. And by golly, when something hits, it also engenders, occasionally, cooperation from the most unsuspected sources, precisely because everyone knows what was going on and what needs to be done or opportunities to pursue. Doesn't mean you don't have arguments. We have them all the time. But now we have an environment where we know that if we bring up a subject, it's not going to blow the family up because it's going to resurrect a lot of past baggage. No, you've got mechanisms in place so you can start to do that. So, tough times now, but if you can get through it, there are a lot of opportunities that are going to open up, if not in this country, in other countries. Others are learning to innovate as well. Just give you one example, then we'll get to some questions. Cisco is one of the great technological marvels of the world. John Chambers has done a superb job developing technology internally, but also knowing how to acquire it and integrate it. You know who his biggest competitor is? A company called Huawei. It's not a convenience store. Huawei, Chinese company, $30 billion, competing with Cisco, Alcatel, other countries around the world. Most have never heard of it. So these new players are emerging. And so innovation is going to be there. And you ought to be on the lookout for it, not just here, but around the world. It is already starting to happen very dramatically. Thank you very much.